Just a second. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to 60 Plus Dialogue. This evening, we are going to be talking about our favorite topic, Niger. Not too long ago, we had a military coup d'etat in Niger, one of our close neighbors. This has caused a lot of consternation in the international community. It has also created challenges for various persons around the world. Ghanaians have come up with their own suggestions to government not to attempt a military intervention. Some are saying it is important that there's a military intervention, and it's all murky. Political dimensions, necessity, need, timeliness, whatever it is, we need to understand whether all that we are looking for is what would make us a great country to live in. Can we live in peace when our next door is burning? This evening, we've assembled a very, very strong panel of, I would say, Ghana's foremost experts on the whole subject of security, international affairs, political science, and so on. Happily, they are also members of the League of Old Men and Women in the country, which is the 60 Plus Dialogue platform. So we have Kwesi that you all know, Dean at the Ghana Armed Forces Command and Staff College, Academic Affairs, Kofi Annan International, and it's Vlad, who is the Dean of the Staff College, Ghana Armed Forces Staff College and Command. Well, I always confuse the name. It's Ghana Armed Forces Command and Staff College. That's where Professor Vladimir Danson is. Kwesi is Director of Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Center, and Bafo Ajimendua is also a foremost governance expert, co-founder of the CDD and the CEO of the Kufuor Foundation. So this evening, we can't go wrong with the people we have assembled. We know you all have questions to ask. We know you all have a lot to also share with us. And it's going to be a dialogue. And so I'll just first of all ask you to hold your horses, take your pen and paper, and just relax whilst we kick off this discussion. I would just go straight off by asking Kwesi to maybe set the tone, and then we can invite our other panelists to speak. For about 20 or so minutes, let's hear them. We are going all the way to 9 p.m. And so this is a very important discussion that we are going to be having. So welcome once again to the 60 Plus Dialogue on the Niger crisis. Welcome. Kwesi, the floor is yours.
Well, Eric, let me thank you very much, and also the 60 Plus team, first and foremost for inviting me into the club of old people, for which I'm very proud, and certainly my two brothers, Vladimir Danson and Bafo Ajimendua. I'm supposed to be sharing my screen, but you know, this technology business, I'm not that good. So within the space of my 15 to 20 minutes, I want to do a couple of things, just to set the ball rolling and to give us some points for conversation. The topic that Eric gave sort of mentioned causes, implications, consequences, threats to democracy, peace and security in West Africa. What I've done is to try to rejig and conflate some of them so that we will have as much time as possible for the conversation. I've added 2 points which I think are very key. This relates to, first, to ECOWAS, because of the interventions and all the narratives about military interventions. To what extent, when we talk about democracy, peace, and security, can ECOWAS be perceived as a norm entrepreneur? And then I have a couple of points relating to that. And then finally, some conclusions in which I make a cautionary tale looking at Machiavelli. So I want to kick off my 15 minutes of glory now. So let me give a bit of introduction and context. We cannot look at Niger without looking at it within the broader context of what is happening on the sub-region. So what this means in practice is that Niger and the coup demonstrates a complex set of interactive factors, both internal, in terms of the politics, levels of corruption, the huge youth bulge, and then the meddlesome behavior of some of our so-called partners that I will come in within Niger itself. And then, of course, several external, factors, once more, within the area in which Niger is located and its place within the international fight against violent extremism. So the coup in Niger fits into a narrative of deteriorating security situation in West Africa and the Sahel, Mali, Togo, Burkina Faso, La Côte d'Ivoire, Benin. But I would argue that it also creates an unconvincing, universalizing narrative of a southward extremist movement towards the coastal states. I take very strong exception to this. And I will come back to that hopefully during the question and answer time. This is a narrative that seeks to create an impression of increasing extremist attacks in the Sahel involving multiple militant Islamic groups. The figures that we have creates methodological problems and creates very serious ethical problems. The narratives are repetitive and they seek to create an ever-widening sort of attacks across the Sahel. I'm beginning to doubt the methodologies used in gathering the data and the extent to which the data is appropriate. And that is how Niger has been couched, that the coup has taken place in Niger. Niger is a critical player in the fight against terror. Niger is very poor, and therefore, whatever has happened in Niger is not so much about what the interest of the people of Niger are. It is about what can we exploit Niger for so that other people can keep themselves safe. So there's a narrative of expanding extremist idea or activities that creates a potential broadening of this act of crisis. I've just been to Togo, northern Benin, southern parts of Burkina Faso, and traveled around all the borders of Ghana. I just did not see this. So we need to take with a pinch of salt all these narratives coming about from Niger. And when the Niger crisis is located within an extremist expansion, my argument is that it is not about the capacity of the extremist groups to expand from Niger towards the littoral states. That is not the issue. It is how the narratives by the extremist groups feed into and exploit domestic imperatives to support their claims. So in all the countries of the Sahel and in all the littoral states, there's a narrative about violence and instability, not because of the way politics is done, but because of extremist groups. And I differ from that, that extremists can only exploit what is available. I also want to make another argument that the fate of Niger's democracy and the Bazoum regime were sealed on the day that Bazoum agreed that French forces who had been kicked out of Mali in February 2022 should relocate to Niger. My argument is that Bazoum and his team misread the depth of anti-French sentiments and believed in the empty rhetoric of its international allies about protection, about security force assistance, and that they would be there for him. The 26th July coup started, I would argue, the day Bazoum said yes to France. It was not about if it would happen, it was about when. The critical question for us this evening, as we talk Niger, I would argue are two. Where will the next coup d'etat be? And when is it going to happen? So what is at play here? We all know that Niger in the literature is characterized as the frying pan of the world, bordering 7 of the most, unstable states, huge, rich. And it is this combination of natural resources, its strategic location, an ever-increasing youthful population, excluded, victimized, dispossessed, increasingly restless, that makes Niger the frying pan of the world. So what is it that we need to be looking at? First are the strategic minerals, loads of them and in different forms. But there's one strategic asset that we don't talk about. That is the huge quantities of clean, clear, usable underground water. We know about the uranium that powers other people's economies, but doesn't power that of Niger. We know about the gold. We know about the lithium. We know about the oil. 2 major projects, one funded by China, I think $3.6 billion, coming down to the coast of Benin to be piped to the world, and a huge trans-Saharan planned pipeline from Nigeria, Niger, Algeria, piped directly into dozens of European countries, estimated at $13 billion. So Niger is an important country. But not only that, in the last 5 to 10 years, Niger has been seen as the southern boundary of Europe. So when Mr. Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, talks about Africans not crossing the desert and the Mediterranean to bring their forest to the gardens of Europe, the crucial fulcrum around which this preventive work is done is Niger. Because of Niger's centrality, there's the desperate interest in preventing Russia and Chinese influences. But what annoys France most is the increasing role of Turkey in providing training for the armed forces of Niger. So we are seeing trade, military, infrastructure, and natural resource development all coming together to form a rather combustible set of elements. The question then is, does this coup represent an end to French and US presence, or a reduction of their influence in West Africa? I think the jury is still out there, so we can wait a little bit. The coup in Niger has also exposed our regional organization in ways that would need to be looked at very carefully. ECOWAS over the past 10 years has failed to consistently apply its own normative frameworks that member states have voluntarily crafted for themselves to guide the way that they do their politics. So President Condé in Guinea failed. We saw a similar thing in La Côte d'Ivoire. In Benin and Togo, there have been some fidgeting with the constitutions. We saw the failure of democracy both in Mali and in Burkina Faso. In all these cases, ECOWAS's interventions or activities were at best minimal. Therein lies the tensions between Niamey and Abuja, that if ECOWAS is to be seen as a norm entrepreneur relating to democracy, peace, good governance, and security, then ECOWAS must fundamentally begin to become an honest broker. Right now, the credibility of ECOWAS is on a tipping point. And I think when Bafo speaks several years ago, Bafo described the ECOWAS project as a, quote, as a heads of states club. And I don't think that has changed very much. But I want to be hopeful tonight. So I want to see ECOWAS, or I want to ask the question, to what extent can Niger create an opportunity for ECOWAS to become a norm entrepreneur? And what do I mean? We need to go back focusing on ECOWAS's constitutional principles. And these principles emphasize four very simple things. First, that every accession to power must be made through free, fair, and transparent elections. Secondly, that there will be zero tolerance for power obtained or maintained by unconstitutional means, which means that those governments in West Africa that fidget with and change constitutions themselves have committed coup d'etats. That is what zero tolerance means. That popular participation in decision-making, strict adherence to democratic principles, and decentralization of power at all levels of governance. And finally, and this is what ECOWAS is interested in, that the armed forces must be apolitical and must be under the command of a legally constituted political authority, and that no serving member of the armed forces may seek to run for elected office. Now, and herein lies my argument and why Niger is critical, both as a fulcrum for stability on the peace and security side, but also in deepening democracy. Were ECOWAS to be bold enough to apply, I think I've got about 5 minutes more, but that's okay. Were ECOWAS to apply its protocol on good governance, democracy, the pamphlet on political principles, and other documents and their constitutive principles, that would provide a normative framework that would seek to establish a democratic culture by providing specific blueprints for state action. Now, what is happening in ECOWAS is that we have a set of norms, values, and principles, but those are applied haphazardly and they are applied in an ad hoc manner, creating a culture that says those of us who sign on to these documents, those rules, principles, and objectives do not apply to us. And with the demographics, with access to smartphones, social media, we are seeing younger people who are saying, no, we will not accept this. So what can ECOWAS's documents help us do? That apart from providing the rules and procedures for state behavior, how states must behave, ECOWAS's democracy regime, and this is where the challenge is in Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Niger, that it must be able to distinguish and concentrate on specific or joint problems that threatens constitutionalism in all its forms. So when somebody changes the constitution, when somebody threatens the media, when somebody packs, the Supreme Court with his or her cronies, these are things that undermine constitutional processes and raises the bar or lowers the bar, as we may want to call it, for others to intervene. My argument, very simple, is that the conception and the application of the word or phrase coup d'etat starts long before the military actually uses guns. And I think ECOWAS's democracy regime points to that. Second is the regime's capacity to engender and advance reliable exchange of information and knowledge. And here, Niger once more teaches us a good lesson. If there were 6 or 7 different countries that were in Niger providing security force assistance, in which ECOWAS was aware, it is quite interesting that it didn't know about the underlying political tensions that seem to be growing. So the question is, how do we intensify confidence and trust-building measures in such a manner that the ECOWAS of the people that we are talking about creates avenues and pathways for people who feel frustrated, excluded, dispossessed, and victimized to send their concerns that can be addressed. But even more importantly is the need to bring in issue linkage among states and citizens. Niger has closed its borders. ECOWAS has instituted a sanctions regime that the international community is saying, no, hang on, you are flouting the basic rules of do no harm. Okay, it's because ECOWAS is incapable of facilitating issue linkage amongst states and also amongst citizens. But even more importantly is the need to strictly or stringently enforce, to monitor, and to verify the rules and guidelines underpinning ECOWAS's own democracy, peace, and security cooperative projects. And I think in Niger, ECOWAS failed to deliver on its public goods. Last 2 slides. But there are other policy documents that defines unconstitutional changes of government in Africa. This is the Lomé Declaration of 2000 and the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance that I have from 2007 that I am sure Bafo will be able to speak to. Unconstitutional changes of government, according to these African Union documents, and also closely related to the ECOWAS document, that unconstitutional changes of government occur when a military coup happens against a democratically elected government, when there's an intervention by mercenaries to replace a democratically elected government. Now, and very interestingly, when these ideas were placed on the table, we thought mercenaries were coming from the outside, or that it's outsiders who hide mercenaries to come and overthrow regimes. Right now, African governments themselves bringing in mercenaries, either to help them to stay in power, get referendums done that are not fair and transparent, or that uses mercenaries to intimidate their own people. Central African Republic is a case in point. Replacement of democratically elected governments by armed dissidents or rebel movements, or the refusal by an incumbent government to relinquish power to the winning party after free, fair, and regular elections. Now, a lot of these documents, particularly the Lomé Declaration of 2000, emphasizes legality over legitimacy, and therefore only stipulates how power must be acquired, but not how it should be exercised. And I think the legal brains here and those who have been in government before hopefully can enlighten us. But when we focus only on the legality and not the legitimacy, it creates issues of credibility and sustainability around the democracy, peace, and security project. Now, 2 more minutes. Article 4P of the Constitutive Act provides, of the African Union, provides for the condemnation and rejection of all unconstitutional governments or changes of government by all member states. That governments which shall come to power through unconstitutional means shall not be allowed to participate in the activities of the Union. Addis Ababa also is not consistent in the application of its own norms, values, and principles. And therefore, a conflation of the Constitutive Act, the Lomé Declaration, enjoins the AU to publicly condemn undemocratic changes, suspend and sanction those concerned, and urge for the speedy return to constitutionalism within a period of 6 months. We know that in Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and then now Niger, the 6 months is not going to take place. And therefore, although the protocol, the AU protocol, gives enforcement measures to the Peace and Security Council, its ability to do so is at best weak. Now, ECOWAS, in its rush to flex its muscle, moved from ground zero to the very top. It didn't talk about sanctions. It spoke immediately about a military intervention, meaning that ECOWAS almost does not have the wiggle room necessary to bring closure to the case of Niger. Niger knows its very critical importance. It knows that ECOWAS is in a difficult place, and therefore the regime has said, what? I'm going to have a 3-year transition plan. ECOWAS, typical of this new robust bellicose approach, says, I am not going to deal with you. We will not accept it. That is a mistake. That is a fundamental mistake, because the regime knows that it has the resources and it has the strength. So let me end by giving some advice. And I'm going to quote Machiavelli. It is evident that many more princes have lost their lives and their states through conspiracies than through open warfare. Because being able to wage open war against a prince is within the reach of very few, while the possibility of conspiring against the prince is open to everyone. If ECOWAS were to intervene, the intervening forces themselves will experience conspiracies that will lead not to wars in their country, but will lead to further destabilization and more coup d'etats on the sub-region. I will rest my case here and listen to my 2 big brothers also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. I think you have, as I say, you've opened a huge library book, and reading it would be a huge challenge. I think that it would not be fair on my part to try and summarize at this time some of the key points you have made. But I think your last quote was exceedingly powerful. And on that note, I would invite Vladimir to also give his opening remarks, after which Professor Bafo Ajinandua would also give the opening remarks, and then we would open the floor for you, our beloved participants, to chip in. We are listening and watching the 60 plus dialogue on the Niger crisis, and you've just heard from Professor Kwesi Ening, Dean of Research and Academic Affairs at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Center. Vladimir. Vladimir, you are muted. Yes, we can hear you now.
Right. I was saying that this platform is going to be a very important platform for the fermentation of ideas and for things to come out of this ferment. Thank you, Kwesi. You have at least created a platform upon which we can now count our ideas also. In the first place, the Niger coup, I agree with Kwesi, has created a new thinking of the ecology of democracy in the West African region. It looks as though we have not understood the basis for the coup and what were the specificities of the Nigerian situation. And therefore, our reactions have been very, very either bellicose or lethargic or, unproductive. In the first place, we must distinguish between the current types of coups we are seeing in Africa. Let us not put all of them in a basket and say coups in Africa, non-democracy, blah, blah, blah. My view is that the coups we experienced in the 60s and 70s are not the same type of coups we are experiencing today. And we must understand that to start with. The coups of the 60s and 70s were conspiratorial coups, aided most importantly by the Cold War. And those coups, if you watched out, majority of them were executed by young officers, young intemperate officers take over and they belt all the generals under their hypnosis. But of late, what is happening is more of a systemic kind of coup. And they are made more by the generals, not by young officers, NCOs and things like that. It is a situation where there is imminent state implosion, state disaster. The whole state is hiccuping, and the generals just find that it appropriate to step in. Mali is a typical example of what I'm trying to describe. In 2012, if the generals had not stepped in, I think the Tuaregs would have overrun Mali by the time ECOWAS said they were going to go in. And so was the case in Guinea and Burkina. And now we have Niger. But some time back, I predicted that Niger was a candidate for a coup. I think I said that on Joy News or somewhere else. And it has come to pass. Let me rush forward in my preliminary presentation to state that there are several other candidates for coups in West Africa right now. And we must be very careful about that. Now we talked about the question of democracy, because he has expatiated long on that, about the very fact that we have accepted democracy and we are having a whole lot of international documents to state that we are not going to go away from it. But the question is, do we really understand democracy? What kind of democracy? Is it the case when we line up people to go and vote, and as they voted, we say, okay, check, we have voted, and therefore we have elected a Democrat to handle affairs? How do we get there? Is the ballot a panacea for democracy? and you get institutions, and we have a constitution to state that we'll change every 4 years, every 5 years, whatever it is. But you mentioned how in some of our own countries, people are fidgeted with the constitutions, and we didn't find that to be endemical to democracy. The Lome document he was referring to was explicit on that. And then in 2001, again, we have a protocol on good governance, which was replicated by the AU in 2004. Everything is clearly stated there, but it looks as though the interpretation is that if it is a civilian government that makes changes and usurps the constitution, there's nothing wrong. But if a soldier comes in, but people are watching all these, the soldiers look at all these, and if they are at the beck and call of the incumbents, and they are the ones who suffer, they go to these jihadists are coming down all the time. In Mali, for example, it was clear that all the interventions were not working. You send the soldiers to the front and they don't return. And that was why they took power, so that they themselves know how to handle their own insecurity. Again, Kwasi mentioned also that, yes, there are several candidates, and I believe that there are candidates. We're all watching what is happening in Senegal, and we are quiet. When it happens, then we say we are suspending Senegal, etc., etc. Do we have the means to be able to understand the specificities of every other country? Is the early warning system working? If it's not working, we need to let it work for us to understand each other. There is something, again, we are forgetting. The moment you begin to talk about integration, putting your countries together for economic development or even for political, whatever it is, you are necessarily saying that you have a collective mind on security. So we have that, we have what we call the regional security complex. It's a complex because you have your individual securities and you want to subsume them under one security. And that's what ECOWAS is trying to do. But we have not been able to understand this regional security complex yet. And therefore, we have not created the architecture for making sure that hand in hand with economic integration is regional security. Luckily for EU, they have NATO, which would, under any circumstance, nip everything in the bud. Even Yugoslavia, which is not part of EU, when there was fire over there, they had to go and stop the fire by disintegrating Yugoslavia to have peace for the regional body. Right. Well, several interventions, as I've already mentioned, have been made in the Sahel. Do we understand the Sahel? Again, I will always talk about specificities. The Americans have been there, the French think it is their domain and they do what they want. And as Kwasi mentioned, clearly there is some anti-French kind of feeling now running across West Africa, or let me say French-speaking countries. And that is essential in any kind of debate or discourse around what is happening in the French-speaking countries. It's very, very important. The feeling of France go away kind of thing is very, very important. We should not also forget that this is the period when geopolitics is reigning very high in the West African sub-region. That as we are against France, the Russians and the Chinese would like to come in, whether we like it or not. Because you mentioned Turkey. It's very, very important. That geopolitical kind of struggle in Africa is essential, and we must understand it. But let me come back also to what Kwasi tried to end up with. ECOWAS attempt at, by all means, protecting democracy. As I've said, I don't think ECOWAS itself understands what they mean by democracy and what kind of democracy they want for themselves. The knee-jerk reaction doesn't pay. And in international discourse, if you threaten and you are unable to fulfill it, it bounces back. If we had actually sent troops to Niger, the possibility is that we may reinstate Bazoum, but then the country will continue to hiccup. The country will continue to be unstable. 2, the returning soldiers may have learned their lessons. And there is the possibility of coups happening in several other African countries because we have similar problems as of Niger also. And so ECOWAS should themselves find out the architectural structures they have in trying to dodge such fires in West Africa. If not, there is the possibility that ECOWAS would disintegrate. And I say so because I asked quite of late, there are several so-called journalists from outside who thronged my office to discuss with me the questions about instability in West Africa and whatnot. And they are almost always interested in China and Russia, China and Russia. In fact, the last person who came to my office, a lady from the Netherlands, I asked her why they are so much interested in China or Russia, as if China has ever come to want to make a coup or want to, but their own countries. The US has made a lot of coups in Africa. Are they aware of that? So these are the things that ECOWAS must learn and know that there will be a problem if they are unable to bite. The last point I would like to make is a question I put to one of the journalists. I said, supposing this thing happens in Nigeria, if there is a coup, there were a coup today in Nigeria, what would ECOWAS say? Would they give 1 week ultimatum? Would they mobilize the standby force to go in? Let's pray it doesn't happen. So we can really see that the threats coming from the so-called protocols are such that they are unfulfillable. Can we have a situation where when things are going bad, some kind of peer review, peer mechanism, so that we don't wait until the soldiers pick up their guns? I said that was my last point, but I asked Kwesi advice. I'm also going to advise with a piece of advice, and I've written a small article about that. Let us know that the ballot does not stop the bullet and will never stop the bullet, provided the ballot is not transparent. Once the type of democracy we are running is such that it may be free but not fair, how people get to power is a big question. Because he mentioned packing the Supreme Courts and whatnot in other places, tweaking or twisting the constitution, etc., all in the name of the ballot, as if we have made the ballot a symbol of democracy. And I'm saying the ballot does not stop the bullet. I rest my case for the time being.
I think that my brother Vladimir is stoking fire in this discussion. Now we realize very clearly that we can also talk about transgender ballots and bullets.
Yeah.
So yes. So thank you very much. I think for the very key point, especially about the fact that some of the tools that are usable in an organization such as ECOWAS are actually unfulfillable protocols. So that means that the tools at the disposal of our countries themselves are challenging. And these would actually act as hindrances to the solution of the problem. But I don't think I have a solution as yet, because the real people are there. Prof, therefore, I think you can close the triangle and let's hear your opening remarks, and then we invite our brothers and sisters to also come in with their questions and comments.
Right, thank you so much. And let me thank Kwesi and Vladimir for giving a very wonderful framework for my own presentation and also for discussions later. Listening to them, there are certain aspects of my outline which I can have to delete so that it doesn't become repetitive. So I want to begin with what seems to be the central key for the so-called intervention that the ECOWAS is proposing. We're talking about democracy and efforts to restore democracy in Niger. That is the main pitch of ECOWAS. There may be other reasons, but let me just focus on this because it's central. And I think democracy itself has been alluded to by the previous speakers. It's in crisis, and we are not facing up to that. Democracy is in crisis. From the so-called citadel of democracy, the United States, to African countries. And Vladimir rightly pointed out, what we have in Africa when we talk of democracy is electoral democracy. Electoral democracy. not practice democracy. So take a few minutes to try to explain the challenge of democracy in Africa, in West Africa in particular, where these things are happening. First, I'll make the point that there's a distinction between practice democracy and principled democracy. Principled democracy relates to the kinds of values and principles and ideals that I think all human beings deserve. So when we talk about justice, liberties, and all that, we're talking principles. We're talking about values that enhance human societies. Practice democracy is the other side of democracy, where people, political communities, construct institutions and systems to enable them to actualize those values that I mentioned earlier. Whilst principled democracy is static, it's unchangeable because it's universal, the practice varies from place to place, depending on the particular culture, history, tradition, and values. So my point here is that, and it's clearly to me, those of us who are glued to the so-called Western notions of democracy when it comes to the party, we need to revise our notes. And I think Brother Menkwasi will know that since the 90s, I've been championing democracy in so many ways, blindly, I have to admit, blindly, because in recent years, I've realized that in fact, I was misleading myself to believe that the practice that we have adopted are basically unsuitable for our environment. And I will say this without any shame at all. And I'll explain why. You see, practice democracy makes democracy not a straitjacket. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, not at all. So if you take Ghana, for instance, we can ask so many questions. Why is it that in our Constitution of 92, no credence was given to certain fundamental values that Ghanaians cherish, certain institutions that Ghanaians cherish? I understand that when you adopt a Republican Constitution, you cannot apply certain so-called traditional institutions, sure. But I'm talking about the values and the principles. We did not do a good job in doing that. So when we talk about the challenge of democracy in Ghana today, I think we can go to the Constitution and pinpoint aspects that seem to contradict or that seem not even to promote or advance certain values that will have made us better, stronger, and prosperous. And that's another discussion we can have. So the simple point I'm making here on democracy is that there's a dissonance, there's a real dissonance between principled democracy and practice democracy. And we are missing out, in our case, the African values, culture, and history in constructing our institutions and systems. So coup d'etats, to a large extent, for now, seem to respond to the democratic failure, as I say. Coup d'etats, at least partly, is due to the failures we are experiencing in our democracies, in addition, of course, to external stimulants and all. So that's the first point I want to make. So if we are talking specifically on Niger, and ECOWAS wants to restore democracy, the first question we ask is, what kind of democracy are we talking about? Because they restore the status quo ante, then of course the same problems will persist, and then we can, like Vladimir said, we can expect another coup d'etat. So we are not solving the problem. I think in most of Africa, especially in West Africa, the challenge is for us to examine critically what aspects of democratic practice democracy, that will be suitable. It's a challenge that I think we need to face. That's just my first preliminary remark. Now let me then turn on to why I think the ECOWAS agenda is defective. And in so many ways, my two good friends have touched on this. But nonetheless, let me see if I can bring anything refreshing. If we are talking democracy, and I'm not going back to what my friends have said, challenging the so-called democratic countries in West Africa, and what basis credibility do they have to even think of restoring democracy in the country? But assuming we are democratic, or these countries are democratic, then in a democratic setting, governments must be responsive to public sentiments. In the current case, it seems to me there is an overwhelming public sentiment against the ECOWAS agenda. That's the agenda for intervention. In Ghana, it's obvious. I don't know any single individual who has supported our country participating in it. In Nigeria, it's worse. Across board, and in fact, the northern states of Nigeria are declaring that if the ECOWAS ever tries to move in, they will join their brothers in Niger. So there's a stiff opposition there. Those who seem to be gung-ho about this, like Côte d'Ivoire or Tara, without challenging his democratic credentials, he is promising one battalion. The battalion consists of how many? My good friends, the military can tell it, between 600, at most 900 people. But experts are telling us that to be successful, we need to have at least twice the number, if not 3 times the number, of the current troop force in Niger. And we understand that Niger has about 20,000 soldiers. So if you promise one battalion, I don't know where they're actually going to go with that. So in a democracy, citizen concerns must be respected. So any decision by the ECOWAS countries, especially the leading countries, Nigeria, Ghana, if we are democratic, then I think our governments need to be responsive to these sentiments of citizens. The second point about why the ECOWAS agenda is effective is what we can all agree to be, whether the decision is rational. Here, the rational actor theory is applied. We need to measure gains against losses. And from all my readings and listening to public commentaries by the experts, Kwesi himself included, and of course, Vladimir. And these guys are working in military institutions. So when they speak, I listen to them carefully and I respect their views very much. The gains to ECOWAS for intervention, in my simple view, will be much smaller than any losses that we stand to. So, in other words, in human and material terms, I don't see what kind of gains we're going to have. So, first of all, I've made the point that if they are going to restore democracy, I don't know what kind of democracy they are going to restore. So, what do we stand to gain? The third point I raise is that I don't think ECOWAS, and our very good friend, all of us, our friend Dr. Musa Fatah, he speaks very eloquently and passionately about the agenda. But I ask myself, what are the strategic interests? It's not well defined. If it's democracy, authority is doubtful. Because restoring democracy cannot be, as my friends have said, cannot be when ECOWAS members have been less democratic in their ways. So what are the strategic interests we seek to gain? We are not even going there to help the Nigerians to take certain action that will benefit them. We are simply going to take the soldiers out. And look, I'm not even sure our ability to overturn what has happened is that simple. The fourth point is what seems to me to be an attempt by ECOWAS to become a proxy for certain external powers whose interests are at stake, particularly France. and of course the Americans. Because ECOWAS interest, if any at all, it seems to me, are very much outshined by the interests of France and the Western Union. So, will that not be ironic for ECOWAS to be proxying for these Western countries? I don't think that is even something we need to consider. And the last point I'm making here, I've just made, brings me perhaps to my final point. It's a very interesting phenomenon. We all know of the upsurge of anti-colonial sentiments. Interestingly, it's not the coup makers in Niger who are championing this sentiment. In fact, when they gave reasons for their coup, they never mentioned that. But of course, the young people are those who are heading it together with African intellectuals who are beginning to see this as a revival of the almost moribund struggle to decolonize in the real sense of the word. So that again has become a major issue. Whether the Nigerian regime, the soldiers, are capable of picking this up to be their new mantra, I do not know. Whether the regime, this current regime, will be influenced by the French in any way, if they are ever to change course, I do not know. But I know that in the other areas where coup d'etats have occurred, in Mali, Burkina Faso, it's different. These two countries have already sacked the French. In Burkina Faso in particular, it seems to me that Sankarism has been revived. That is, reviving the ideas of Thomas Sankara. Because he was a young officer, like Rawlins at the time, staunchly anti-imperialist. And if that's the case, then of course, it's a good omen for us. But as I say, unless the leaders themselves see this as an opening for them to rethink how they want to move forward with the country, if they see that, then this new upset of the anti-colonial sentiments can be utilized to really gain some grounds and strengthen their struggles to change their circumstances. Because I think Percy did a good job citing the various natural resources of Niger that is making the French and the Americans unhappy about this, and therefore seeking to support perhaps ECOWAS intervention. At the same time, though, let me caution also that they're coming into the play, this picture, by the Russians, whether Wagner, just read report that the Wagner chief is dead in a plane crash, whether it's a joke or something, I don't know, but it just flashed through the news, okay? Whether they are coming or not, I don't think it is wise for us to replace one foreign exploiter with another one. I think the fundamental issue in international relations, no country acts in your interest. They always act in their self-interest. So if they are flocking in, promising freedom for Africa, that saddens me. I think this is where ECOWAS should begin to re-strategize. Not necessarily to restore democracy, but how our unity can be strengthened so that West Africa as a whole can withstand the onslaught of these foreign imperialists who are bent on capitalizing on their power to gain from us and continue to impoverish African countries. So in effect, this is just my comments, and I hope in the discussions we can all brainstorm on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bafo. I think if I were to take a course in the spoken word, I would learn new words, ecology of democracy, principled, practiced democracy, principled democracy, and the like. I think on the basis of the tone that the three of you have set, let me ask a couple of quick questions. This will be general for all three of you, and maybe you can each answer as many of them as you can. One quick one. Can we ask for a transition of some sort? I'm not talking about a transition for the soldiers to go back to their barracks or whatever, but can we ask for some form of a transition where we can end this crisis? How long should that transition be? What form of transition should it be, or what conditions can be laid down for such a transition? Kwesi, maybe you can take up that one, and then Vladimir can pick up, and then Bafo.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we ask for a transition? I think when military, let me make this point.
If you can be closer to your microphone.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Yes, good. Let me make this start by making this point. Coup d'etats are not good for the militaries themselves. It undermines institutional ethos. It turns the hierarchical processes and mechanisms upside down. And by the time the military leaves power, they more often than not have become probably more corrupt than the civilians that they overthrew. But when militaries do take power, particularly within a sub-region with normative frameworks, as we have in ECOWAS, that does not have the military wherewithal to go and fight, then transitions or negotiated transitions become very key. Negotiated transitions are driven by knowledge and not by the bellicose language that we have seen from those who have spoken on behalf of ECOWAS. Now, in negotiation processes, anger is used as a deliberate weapon to bring your opponent onto the table, sometimes with a reduced set of options, so that we can move towards a win-win situation. But when you don't have the wherewithal to back your words with that capacity to elicit compliance with your threats, you become a laughingstock when you talk to your opponent. And that is what ECOWAS has done. And therein lies the regime's argument that it was a 3-year transition. But Eric, it's much more complex than that. When the coup happened, they were talking about we will reinstate Bazoum. Now it has become, make sure you don't kill him. Oh, he's now very healthy. The Americans have diverged from the French. They've already appointed a new ambassador. They claim who will go to Niamey, but will not present her credentials. An old Africa hand. So for most of those who started making noise, they waited for far too long because ECOWAS shot themselves in the foot and made it impossible to negotiate and take the moral high ground. So transitions were always in the mix. The question is, how do you bring the belligerent party, in this case, the military in Niamey, to the table? ECOWAS, unfortunately, misread all the signals. So transitions will end the crisis, but we've seen transitions in Guinea.
Guinea is sitting on 54% of the world's iron ore. So the gentleman in Conakry knows that nobody can mess up with him. He has a resource that China, Russia, Austria, France are all fighting for. Mr. Sarkozy, who is wearing a knee ankle for corruption, is the representative of the French company to Guinea. Mr. Tony Blair, with his big talk about democracy, came there to earn a couple of pennies. So this is not about democracy at all. This is about greed, pure and simple. So those who take power can then play games and say, let's have a transition. And we will determine how we do the transition. Because by the time the 3 years is over in Niamey, very few of the governments making noise on behalf of ECOWAS will still be in power. Either they would have lost an election, or there would have been a revolt, or they would have been overthrown. So transitions are useful, but they can only be met by multilateral institutions that are driven by knowledge, that understand the nuances of negotiation, and also understand how threats can be made that can also be effective. So the conditions for successful transitional processes and negotiations that Bas has left ECOWAS behind, I think, not in Abuja, but probably somewhere between Accra and Abuja.
Thank you very much.
Have that gravitas here.
Thank you very much. Vladimir, would you like to add?
Yeah, sure. Let me go from the philosophical angle. Coups are a terrible jolt in the ordinary way of doing things, that is a democratic dispensation. And once there is a jolt, it means something has terminated some order that we knew. And whether we like it or not, if we want to go back to a better kind of form of governance, then transitions are inevitable. And as Kwesi has said, what kind of transition? If you don't learn and if you don't understand, you go into a transition that worsens the situation. And we have had such situations in West Africa before. The transitions that we called for in Charles Taylor's issue, for example, and that is where I had my mantra from: the ballot does not stop the bullet. We just thought that the transition should be just line people up and go and vote, and then we are finished with the transition. We return to so-called civilian rule. And we all knew the second war in Liberia was more brutal. We had a similar situation in Mali, where the transition in 2012 led to a government, wishy-washy kind of government, and the one thing led to another, and we had another coup and another coup and another coup. In Guinea, it was the same thing. So it's like, as Kwesi is saying, what kind of transition? Who holds the which keys to the transition? The junta themselves will want always an exit strategy. And therefore, we need to study their morale, their thinking, and find a way of transiting in such a way that there is some kind of stability. In Ghana, we had a similar situation. If we had tried to hound Jerry Rawlings out, we would have gone to a civil war. But the transition was smooth, aided by the international call for a third wave of democratic dispensations. And we transited quietly by showing how we want a constitution, we want this, and the transition was smooth. So in Mali or in any other place, especially Niger, the situation is such that the only way we can have some stability in Niger is to transit from this current dispensation to a more prudent dispensation and a more stable dispensation. If we hurry the junta out, we have a constitution that cripples them or whatever it is, we'll have a situation where more instability will come. Therefore, let us find a way of transiting, which is inevitable anyway, but what kind of transition? Are we just going to draw a constitution, put in all those fine words, and put a Bazoum-like person there and we say, hooray, we have transited? Let us work through the matrix and know exactly what kind of transition. Transition is inevitable.
Thank you very much. Therefore, if you can also add, but let me add a question to it. It's a question from one of our members. He's asking, DAG, he or she is asking, is it not because of the threat by ECOWAS that has caused the junta in Mali to open up for this for negotiations? So in answering the question, if you can throw in a response to this from one of our participants.
Thank you. First of all, I do agree with my colleagues that in the first place, the decision by ECOWAS.
I think your microphone is a little far from your mouth.
Okay, you hear me now better? Yeah.
It's a little better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Yes, I was saying that the decision making of ECOWAS in this particular case is quite suspicious. You see, the leader of ECOWAS came into office, and within weeks, this event occurred. And Tinubu, I don't believe, is seasoned in sub-regional politics. He was a governor. I don't know if he was seasoned enough, and he didn't have time to study at all. So, quote unquote, with his immaturity, he had to head the ECOWAS. And that decision, I'm not even sure it was collectively made at the time, or whether Tinubu made a decision and then roped the others in. Kwesi and Vladimir, you guys are closer to these things, so maybe you can help me out there. You see, because if you look at the way he preempted all possible alternatives to military intervention, like Kwesi said, we find ourselves in a bind. Now to your question directly. Yes, I agree. And when Kwesi talks about negotiated transition, or Vladimir talks about constitutional transition, they all boil down to one: democratic transition. So if you recall my earlier comments on democracy, you can agree with me that it shouldn't be the routine elections to elect new people on the constitution that is not in sync with practice democracy. If that happens, then that transition will be hollow, and we can expect another revolt, if not now, later, because they won't be addressing the fundamental issues of the Nigerian community. So yes, transition, but I think if it's a democratic transition, then there's a fine opportunity for ECOWAS to support Niger to recreate the appropriate democratic practice that will make it possible for Nigerians to coexist. And when I talk about the practice here in Nigeria, look at all the conditions over there. Look at their social structures. Look at their traditions, history, connections, and all. And based on that, create systems that will be all inclusive, that will be fully participatory, that will address some of these fundamental issues, managing their wealth, even that could deal with the external imposition from France and elsewhere. So that's, if they do that, then I think we can be seriously trying to get them to enter a new phase in the democracy in West Africa. So for me, if it is democratic transition, then my concern would be making sure that whatever systems or mechanisms they put up to achieve that end, they should have in mind what kind of democracy, practice democracy, is best suitable for Nigerians. Now with the threat from Mali, sure, I mean, it's clear, not only from Mali, but from Burkina Faso. These two countries have already sworn that, look, if you attack them, we're all coming. And today I read in the papers that, in the media, that Burkina Faso has received $400 million worth of new military equipment. Whether that was meant for this or not, I don't know. But if that is true, it tells you that they are building up possible support for the Nigerians. And mind you, nobody's interested in the fratricidal war. I mean, it won't make any sense for Nigeria, Ghana, and the others to even get into Niger to face this kind of situation. So both Mali and Niger are certainly supportive of Niger. I mean, Mali and Burkina Faso are supportive, and their role in resolving or managing this particular conflict, for me, is critical. It's critical because they have used the opportunity that they have to build an unexpected kind of friendship bond with for the three countries. And with the so-called Russians lurking around and promising freedom and support and all, then it means that, like somebody has suggested, we may be seeing the collapse of ECOWAS, because if these three members are going to stand to fight the rest of us, then what is ECOWAS? We will simply destroy. So I think any transitional approach to this problem should necessarily include these other countries that are showing great interest and support for the Nigerians.
Thank you so much. I think it is time for us to open up to beloved participants. We are in the dialogue room with the 60 plus platform team members, Professor Bafo Ajimandia, who is the CEO of the Coup Foundation, Professor Vladimir Enchidanso, who is the Dean of Academic Affairs at the Ghana Armed Forces Command and Staff College, and Professor Kwesi Enin, who is Dean of Research and Academic Affairs at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Centers, who are all members of the 60 plus platform, a platform of old men and women, luckily for Ghanaians who refuse to grow old and are active in their mind, and we like to share ideas. So you're all very welcome. We will now open the floor. These are the ground rules. We would allow you to unmute yourself in a minute, but I would urge each one of you, if you wish to speak, please use the tools in your Zoom interface, raise your hand and I will call you. We will please request that all others who are not called to please not speak when we or unmute yourself. So as we speak now, we've allowed you to unmute yourself. I do have one request from Mr. Sunil Mathurani, who would like to make a direct contribution to a point that was made. Mr. Sunil Mathurani, you are recognized. You may unmute yourself, please. Mr. Matrani? If Mr. Matrani, I see you, but okay. Whilst waiting for him to come up or any other member to come up, there's a question from Nana Kwesi Asante to panelists. Has this coup d'etat got anything to do with the gas project from Nigeria through Niger to Europe? Any of you can pick up the question to answer, please.
Well, I think the coup cannot have a monocausal kind of relationship towards this project. When the coup happens, all kinds of variables are used to justify the coup. Of course, there may be some elements in Niger who were sort of opposed, not necessarily to the project, but to the fact that this project is going to benefit Europe and they, the Nigerians, are not going to benefit in any way. So the coup makers could easily use this to enhance their popularity or whatever it is. But I strongly suspect that underlying the factors that call for the coup is this kind of project which most elite in Niger found not beneficial to the Nigerians. And I strongly suspect that it is not the main cause, but at least it has something to do with the anger that they had for such projects which do not benefit them.
Thank you very much. So if we use Niger as an example, Eulalie, if you can hold on a second, if we use Niger as an example, what form of government would be the next option? Because you've talked about the kind of system that must be in place, where it's not just voting by ballot. What exactly are you talking about? Maybe Bafo, you can pick that, and then the colleagues can take up the question.
Yes, that is a very important question. It's very interesting also, and the answer will not be necessarily direct. What kind of system are you talking about? What kind of system should replace what you have? That's the question, right?
Yes.
You see, in a case like this, it's not going to be easy for ECOWAS, or for that matter, any power to simply displace the soldiers. We have seen this in West Africa many times. As much as we have a distaste for military, and they should never dare come into politics. Once it happens, it becomes a different ball game, and negotiations and arrangements will have to be different. I think personally that in a negotiated settlement or transition, as Kwesi said earlier, we should be looking for a period where all hands should be on deck, cross-section of the people coming together to negotiate for structures and systems for a new democracy that they want. Ultimately, we should be looking for a democratic Niger, but not in the conventional sense of the word. I have strong exception to Western countries foisting on African countries a democracy that they themselves are failing, especially when America comes to the picture. I get a little bit irritated. For the past 5 or so years, or more, I mean the Trump era, if before then, if anybody thought America will have this crisis, nobody would believe me. But they have realized that. And if you look at the literature by American political scientists today, they are all raising questions about their democracy. Some even believe that it's going to fail. So in that respect, I don't think we have to entertain these kinds of foreign positions. I think it's time for African countries. We are all human beings, and therefore we deserve, all of us deserve those values I mentioned earlier, freedoms and liberties and justice and what have you. But the structures and the institutions and systems that will help us achieve that should be in consonance with the peculiarities of Niger. I hope it's not too theoretical, but that's all I can say, because you cannot, for instance, if it's, why would you choose 4-year tenure for president? What's the rationale for saying be there for 4 years? Why not 2, why not 5, why not 10? You need to rationalize that. Okay? So in the same way, we can question so many of the positions that we have been having all these years when it comes to democracy. So my simple answer to you is we just simply have to get all Nigerians together to brainstorm on what is best for their country. If what is best for them at this moment should include military leaders in government, so be it. We should respect it. But I don't think there should be any foreign imposition in terms of how they go forward in their country.
I saw both Kwesi and Vlad nodding and shaking their heads. Sometimes I wasn't sure whether. So Kwesi.
Okay, Eric, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. But actually, I agree with what Bafo is saying, but I wanted to go back to 2 things very quickly.
Okay.
One about ECOWAS's credibility and survivability, and then the second about the gas pipeline. Eric and the 60 plus. We all join organizations because we have shared values and shared norms. when you have 4 countries that have made coup d'etats and 3 countries that have fidgeted with the constitutions, but you couldn't talk, it means 50% of your members don't really believe in the thing that they have signed on to. And that is a crisis of credibility. The second is about the gas pipeline as a reason for the coup. I think, as Vladimir says, those who make coups will hang on to any strand of excuse. The pipeline, and here lies the Nigerian rush for war. The Kaji Dam in Nigeria was built on an express agreement between Nigeria and Niger that they would not dam their section of the Niger River. That's number one. Number two, the decision by the junta to seek to try Bazoum on high treason is because they've gotten access to documents about things that may have been signed. So because we failed in dealing with the regime in an appropriate manner, they're also grabbing at straw. Finally, Eric, all the nodding when Bafo was talking, is that I was thinking about an earlier point that we made about having a Republican constitution or republicanism and the role of chiefs or traditional elders. Bafo, is it possible that since Western forms of democracy have failed, that we find and begin a process of developing some hybrid form of governance? Because I remember Mr. Rawlings always say, if you think you are not corrupt, let's go to the Antoine Shrine. So maybe we now need to be bold enough to start a process of saying, look, what is it that speaks to us where we can recognize? Because all the 90 plus people who are here, were we to be the treasurers of our traditional organizations, very few of us will dip our hands into the cookie jar. But right now, we know that with appropriate networks, you can dip your hands and we'll find appropriate reasons to let you go scot-free. So probably, Bafo, the time has come for us to start looking at alternatives and different combinations. I can see Vladimir is laughing at me. So
yeah, so we'll take Vladimir's question. Therefore, pack that question from Kwesi, because I do have 3 participants whose hands have been up for a while, and Sunil Matrani.
Right. I'll be very short on this.
Okay. Yes.
It's just a footnote to what they have said already. My take on this is very simple. The only commodity on earth that is not exchangeable, that is not exportable, that is not importable is democracy. Because no 2 democracies are the same. And democracy must be brewed with ingredients as the specificities of the country that is wanting to practice that kind of democracy. So as I was laughing when Kwesi was making his contribution, is because he is believing in the additions of anything that will make the democracy stay, that will make the ownership of that democracy the people's democracy. And I believe in that too. Because, as Bafo asked, what is there in saying that we go 4 years or 6 years or something? Why not 10 years? Why not whatever? And so, yes, in this transitional process, they need to understand their own specificities. They need to understand their own history. I remember the South African Constitution when it was being debated in 1994. The side of Mandela were talking about their own history. Where are we and where do we want to go? And this should form the platform upon which the negotiations for what kind of democracy they want should be. Other than that, you go in for something you have borrowed, but then you don't have the props to sustain any superstructure that is on props that are not sustainable will collapse. And I think I agree with my colleagues that, look, it must be sustainable in terms of what is there to make the type of democracy they want stay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Matrani.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you. This is a perspective from Abidjan, where I've been living for the last 10 years. I'm a World Bank retiree who has worked a lot in the region, in Ghana. And I see from the names, there are old friends present. Greetings to you all. The first thing I wanted to just add is that today we have an unbroken band of countries stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, all of which are controlled by the military. If you go from west to east, you have Guinea, Mali, Burkina, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. This entire band is now in the hands of the military. And that is something that is not a happy situation for the continent. The second thing I wanted to say was to confirm or agree with what was said earlier. ECOWAS is going through a deep crisis and is faced with the possibility of breaking up. Why? Because of this divergence between the interests of the old men's club, as was mentioned by one of the speakers earlier, Ouattara, the presidents of Ghana and Nigeria, who have a different perspective on the world than some of the younger leaders. The monkeying with the constitutions, whereby term limits have been removed and age limits have been removed in Côte d'Ivoire and elsewhere, all of this means that the people who now run those countries have a serious problem of credibility and legitimacy. And they are terrified that the example of the Sahel is now going to reproduce itself in their own countries. And hence their haste and foolishness in proposing something which can never work, which is a military intervention in Niger. The last comment I would make is that I think, yes, time is up for the French in West Africa, and that's long overdue. And it was said earlier that Bazoum's demise was written the day he agreed, absolutely, when he accepted that the French troops should come over. That's absolutely true. Now, where are they going to go from Niger? Are they going to come to Côte d'Ivoire? One can't rule that out. As long as Ouattara is in power, the French will be comfortable. But Ouattara is not eternal. So that is a big issue. What can ECOWAS do now to backpedal is the question. How can they get themselves out of this mess that they have created for themselves? And there's this disconnect between the leadership and the intelligentsia and the technocrats, people like us who think about what this organization could and should do. And that is something that I think, apart from Ghana, perhaps in Nigeria, where these things are discussed freely in the press, I do not think that in French West Africa there is any serious forum in which these kind of issues are put on the table and are debated. And yet that is absolutely important that that should happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like panelists to hold on to some of the issues that Mr. Matrani has raised. I'll go to Theo Ni Okai, and then we'll follow by DAG1. Like I said, DAG1, please let us know your real name or send it to me, and then I'll recognize you to speak, and then Dr. Farid Arthur. Engineer Theo Okai.
Thank you very much, Eric. You're doing a fantastic job facilitating. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. Just a quick one. I've been quite concerned when I looked at the energy distribution in terms of sources for France. Nuclear is the main energy source in France. In 2022, nuclear power accounted for 63% of the country's energy mix. 63%.
Now, where do they get their uranium to power the plants? They were getting a quick and good deal from Niger. And so I wish and hope that the old man's club in ECOWAS would not be fighting a proxy war for France as a result of the fact that their source for energy is being threatened by this coup d'etat that has occurred. What do you think about that? And that's the question to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. DAG1 is Alfred Yabua. You are recognized.
Thank you very much. Yes, let me confess that I've enjoyed the discussions. I have some few issues that I would not like to raise. Now, if you look at the coup d'etats in West Africa, it is situated within the West African sub-region. And if you look at the dynamics, is it not the case that a struggle within the P5 of the UN that is gradually taking this kind of shape or seat in West Africa? I mean, if you look at US, France, and Britain on one side is against Russia and then China. Is it not that struggle that's gradually also destabilizing the West African sub-region? That's my first question. Then, if that is the case, the second question, how can it be remedied, especially since you may have other African countries which may also suffer the same fate because they may belong to the P3 or the P2. Then the last question has to do with
for the benefit of illiterates like us, what is P5? What is P2? Do you mean primary class 2? Or...
Sorry, the permanent members of the UN Security Council.
Okay, because
by P3, I'm talking about US, Britain, and France. Okay. And the other two, I'm talking about Russia and China.
Okay, so when you add P3 and P2, you get P5.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. I like the matter.
One has to do with the ECOWAS and the influence of this P2 and P3. Is it not the case that there is kind of suspicion among the ECOWAS members that some of these P5 members are in bed with them, and that's why they act at certain times and they do not act at other times?
So I think your question, the last one, identifies with the point that Yokai made, that are we in a sense not acting as proxies for one or more of these powerful countries?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfred. Thank you. Dr. Faridata, your hand is up.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that the two constant characteristics of the big word democracy in Africa is increasingly becoming established is the holding of elections that inevitably will become challenged, and in between elections, a complete process of state capture. So we have a challenged election, and in between it, it's like those who finally get into power believe that because you have to wait for 5 years, I don't have to answer to you. I can do anything I want with the state until after 5 years, and then you can throw me out. And then after 5 years, an election is held that is disputed. And so then gradually now we have lost even faith in the election. The issue, therefore, is what happens to the integrity of the electoral process in between? Okay. There's absolutely lack of accountability. We don't account to anybody. Nobody is held accountable. And this almost feeling that, well, you can't do anything to me until after 5 years or 4 years is also looking like some expressing itself in a form of impudence. You know, when that happens, that already leads to a situation which you would put in this way, that those who are making peaceful change impossible make violent change inevitable. And so therefore, interventions then will occur for as long as we are unable to make elections and democracy have a proper meaning for us beyond going for state capture that we cannot hold accountable. So when elections occur, what is really happening? As far as I believe I see it, the army has a pressure valve effect on the crisis that leads to the election. Tension comes up, the army comes in. It's just like when you are having a pressure cooker and it's boiled up and boiled up, so somebody opens it to allow the pressure to ease down before you can dip your hands in. But that is also not a solution, because sooner or later the people will realize that, well, the army itself has also not lived up to its the expectations. Take, for instance, the Niger case. It was a bloodless coup, and the whole nation is supporting it. That's because people were under tension and under pressure and didn't like what was happening. And the army has now come to release the valves. The next thing is that those expectations that the people have invested in the army, can they be justified? And the answer is no. And the answer is no. And so then it leads to the urge for handing over transition. But when you look at how do we hand over and what do we hand over to? Inevitably, we end up handing over to the same system that we overthrew. The reason being that instead of then building into the new system the issues that led to this collapse, we rather go back, listen to what the West tells us about democracy, and try to establish another form of Western so-called democracy, which has already failed us. We try to establish a form of democracy that still does not have enough accountability systems built into it. And so therefore, if we need to move forward, otherwise we're going to get stuck in this vicious cycle of going under pressure, having a regime change either violently or questionably peacefully, and then coming back to this discussions that we have. We Africans, those of us who have a voice in any way, should ensure that we push for the establishment of accountability institutions that take care of us in between elections. When somebody does something, that person must be held accountable. And yet, that is precisely what we try to avoid to do when we move over into the constitutional realm. So I believe that unless we solve that issue of accountability in between, and that will resolve the issue of state capture and create a more equitable and fair society, these things will continue, repeating themselves. I think I would end on that.
Thank you very much. We do have two more questions, after which I'll pause and let my panelists address them broadly, because most of them are alike. Martin Pettigo, and before you do that, let me kindly ask all participants, if you wish to receive a copy of this discussion, kindly to be invited to the next 60 Plus dialogue. I would like you to use the chat room and just send your name, your email address, and your phone contact that we can reach you on WhatsApp, and we would be glad to engage with you in the coming weeks and months. Martin Pettigo, you are up, and then Eulalie, if you can get your name spelled out correctly, we will be pleased to welcome you to ask your question, and we'll get answers for you. So Martin Pettigo, you are welcome. Please unmute yourself first.
Hello, can you unmute me? I'm driving, so it's very difficult, but it's a very interesting
I have asked, you are already speaking, so we can hear you, so continue to.
All right, I just want to say it's a very interesting program. I'm speaking from the United States. I'm CEO of Mosaic Media. I just wanted to ask a few questions, and I'm just going to be as low as possible when it comes to the English language. You see, before the Frenchman came to Africa, we were already here. Before the French set their foot here on this continent, we were already here. Now, my question to our leadership, elected officials, when they go on for these OAU conferences or ECOWAS conferences, what is the tone of language if they are negotiating with the French? Because this is our land. This land belongs to us. They are just guests. You know, I know they call themselves our colonial masters, but we are Africans. Now, what is happening in Mali is a significance that it's about time that we Africans begin to form some pressure movement to help our brothers who were colonized by the French to set them free, or else without that, the vision of Kwame Nkrumah that the liberation of the whole of, African independence has no meaning until it's the whole African is being liberated. I think it's about time. Now, I have witnessed so many elections in all over the world, and it surprises me that it's only in Ghana or in Nigeria that when it's time for elections, they share cars to our elected officials. What kind of democracy is this? In America or in the UK or in Britain, we don't see people sharing cars for people to vote for them. So I believe that our kind of democracy is drifting away from exactly the meaning of what democracy that we decided to embrace. This is my question, please.
Thank you very much. Eulalie Deganus, you're the last questioner, and then we'll do one round of responses before we come back, if there is time. Eulalie.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm actually, this is my first listening, and I think I'm quite, I want to say I'm quite grateful for the opportunity to have a very basic question. I think I have listened in, and I agree with what the panelists have pretty much shared in terms of perspective and how possibly the threat of military action may be a little bit, may have jumped the gun a little bit and so on. I think my question though is, I mean, if indeed that they feel pressured, ECOWAS feels pressured to go and sort of embark on this military adventurism, I don't know if any of the panelists has addressed or has looked at what kind of exit strategy would they have. I mean, we all know what happened in Libya and the consequences of that military action and how that has sort of destabilized that country. Does ECOWAS thought through what may happen if this war extends? And if they do in fact install Bazoum, does ECOWAS plan to have an occupying force there to protect him? I mean, questions like, I mean, how do we even anticipate maybe the French and other colonial powers seeing this extended war as an opportunity to come back and under the guise of enforcing some kind of peace, create occupying forces on the territories that they left? So I think that for ECOWAS, I don't know how strategic and how long-term they are looking at this intervention in Niger, and I don't know if it was also addressed why they didn't go to a country like Guinea or Guinea, I mean, why single out Niger? They all have had coups. So what is the area in which makes this particular case a lot more threatening to them, except that maybe the French are pressuring them? So yeah, I was looking more at maybe if they could address what would be a possible exit strategy, how would they get out of this situation and not have to occupy that land and so on and so forth. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Resi, Vlad, and Bafo. I think you've got a plate of questions to look at. The issues of the proxy war, the issues of suspicion, the role of the primary school numbers, P2, P3, P5, the problem of state capture and integrity of electoral processes, and how in between elections things are done in such a way as if we never learn any lessons. The whole notion of an exit strategy, and indeed the role of ECOWAS itself in not tackling some of these other challenges in other places. This was addressed earlier on by Kwesi, but it would be helpful if in addressing these, we can tie up responses in broad terms. It looks like we may have to do a part 2 of this discussion because all too soon we are less than 30 minutes from the end of our time, and it will just amaze you. And I'm sure our panelists have not even come out. We've not seen the best of our panelists even as yet, but let's see how it will go till we get to 9 o'clock. So Kwesi, Vlad, and Bafo, in any order.
Well, I think I would defer to Vlad to start this time around.
Okay.
Thank you, Kwesi. I think I'll start. I normally like to start from the freshest of the interventions. And I think Hillary put it right there. What exit strategy can there be? And it ties in with what I started early. The point that we wanted to enter and restore Bazoum. Were we baking some democracy here and go and give it to the Nigerians and leave, or we're going to have an occupation force? And she put it right there. And I think we have all agreed that that kind of action was a non-starter. And as we have all agreed also, when there is a coup, there should be an exit strategy. The question is, what kind of strategy? I have advocated for dialogue, principled negotiated dialogue, so that we are able to have, in the first place, what kind of institutional props there should be for any future government, and what type of democracy that suits the specificities of Niger. And I believe if we negotiate with the junta, as Kwesi put it, they now want to accumulate all kinds of variables to be able to negotiate. That they want to try the former head of state is one of their chips now they will put as bargaining. And I believe that we all have to also take all these things into consideration in our negotiation with them. My point is helping them get out of the quagmire. They entered this because of what Farid was saying. It's very important, and that's true. In Africa, we have imposed on ourselves a kind of democracy that leaves a lacuna, a huge gap between elections and the next elections. So people make all kinds of promises and use all tools in the tools box to get elected. Somebody was talking about the distribution of cars and whatnot, not only cars, cash, everything to get there. And then the world applauds that, oh, we have a democracy in, say, country Ghana. But then how the people got there was itself fraudulent. And after they have captured state power, what happens is that state capture becomes the order of the day. There's no accountability. And in between one election and the other, at the next election, we use the same method, even a higher form of it, to get back to square one. And there's no accountability. It prepares the ground for the only institution that has the wherewithal to be able to stop this nasty situation, that is the military, to enter. And when they enter, we are angry. But we haven't made it possible for the gap between elections, governance, and the next election to be addressed. And I believe that if we know this, then ECOWAS must rather help those countries that fall into such categories to be able to get out of it and maintain some kind of stability. That's very important. The French energy, well, that's obvious. We all know how France relies on the colonies up till now to make France what it is today. The colonial tax is still there, and exploitation of French colonies are still there. They still pay the colonial tax. They have to put not less than 85% of their reserves in French banks and pay tax on those reserves. So all these things are clear examples of what may have prompted the military to take over there. The P5, P2, P3, yes. The P5 is such that there is geopolitical contestation amongst them. But the P3 on one side and P2 on the other side. And I hope he explained what P2 and P3 means. If you put them together, they become P5. And Africa is a battleground, a strong battleground because of the resources of Africa and because of the governance systems of Africa. They are able to try and build several African countries under their hypnosis such that they could continue to exploit. And so you are very right, the P2, P3 contestation in Africa creates the condition where we are eclipsed and we are unable to, excuse me, we're able to govern ourselves, but govern as per the whims and caprices of either the P2 or the P5. So that's a very good point that was made. I've mentioned that with Farid already, and I think this is where I'll end.
The proxy war issue.
The proxy war issue, natural fact, yes, there is always the tendency to cause African countries to do the bidding of, like I was saying, the journalists who came to my office, did they understand why we want to invite China or Russia to Africa? And I asked, whom do we invite? Why don't you compete with China or Russia on the African continent, and you want to tell us who our friends should be? So the proxy war will always be there because of realism. In fact, you always want to get a terrain where you make your opponent smaller. And so Africa has been a terrain where there is always a proxy war. Right now, what ECOWAS was doing, most of us speculated that some African leaders were being coerced or being promised whatever it is to get in there quickly. 1 week, get in there whilst it is hot. And then you see the French troops saying that we are coming in to support, or NATO saying, let me take up the war. You know, so it's clearly a well-written camouflage thing on a white wall, a white painting on a white wall, trying to force Africa to fight itself. So I will agree on that speculated kind of thinking, conspiracy kind of theory, that yes, the West would have loved to see ECOWAS do their bidding for them, the proxy war in Africa. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwesi, and then Bafo.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me start with Sunil. I think Sunil makes a very good point, looking at the stretch of unstable states. And then we need to ask ourselves, I mean, from Mauritania with criminal fishing networks, you know, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and now the Sudan. And you wonder to yourself, what is it that drives these countries? And who makes the selection as to which country should play a particular role? Because if we take Chad, for example, I mean, when the Niger crisis came, I mean, Chad of all countries, you know, was sent to Niger to try and talk to the new leaders. And it's very, very clear that there's a huge disconnect between those who are governing these our multilateral institutions and then the generality of the people, not least the intelligentsia. And I think when we talk P2, P3, and then P5, there ought to have been a P1 for this continent. And in 2005 and 2007, when these debates were going on within the African Union and the discussions around the Ezowini consensus, if you saw the way our heads of states behaved in Addis Ababa, the shallowness of the conversation and arguments and the splits as to how whatever seats would be given to this continent would be shared amongst the 5 regional economic communities, then one would get a better sense of why we are moving nowhere very fast. So all the questions that we are talking about are all interlinked and intercoordinated. So Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal. Let me make one point about Senegal. When Macky Sall, as president or chair of the African Union, went to Mr. Putin and Zelensky to go and beg for grain, my argument was that he did not go to beg for grain. He went to look for alternatives for support in case he decided not to run or not to hand over. and what kind of alternative military support he could depend upon. Please go back and calculate when Macky Sall said he didn't want to do a third term. That was when our friend, who supposedly has just fallen out of the sky, had lost his power in his move on Moscow. Immediately, Macky Sall heard that the man is back on the scene. The first thing he did was to ban the opposition and to arrest Mr. Songo. My argument is that were this guy to continue to live and to come to Niger, he would have retracted his words. So there are these complexities that undergird and underpin our politics. And I think this ties in nicely with Farid's point about constitutional elections, and between the next challenged election, there is state capture. But there's a new variable that is beginning to get out of shape. In almost every West African and Sahelian country, we've empowered a group of people, young people, train them, turn them into violent elements who then facilitate this challenge or contested elections. They've seen how the misuse of their strengths creates power alternatives for people. So for most of last year, in the last part of last year, I traveled to about 23 towns along Ghana's border regions. And in those border towns, political parties themselves, now it is not inter-party violence, it is intra-party, in which Vladimir and I, as members of the same party, cannot be in the same room without our bodyguards. This is in Ghana. This is a report written for the UNDP to demonstrate how the challenge to state stability and to democratic stability will not come from violent extremists, but the manner in which the contestations for political power become manifested. So I think, Farid, you have a great point about what happens between two challenged or contested elections. It is not only about the capture of the state, it is about the release of very violent forms of expression. Violence has become a currency in almost every single election across the sub-region. I was an observer with my team during the Nigerian elections, and that was a different ball game altogether. Yes. So Eulali's point, very straightforward, there is no exit strategy. If you listen to the discourses coming out of Paris, Madame Catherine Colonna, the foreign minister, spoke about Niger as if they were still a colony, that the people in Niger could be ordered about as if they were her cattle. And it is the same type of behavior that was shown in Mali and in Burkina Faso, where in both Mali and Burkina Faso, it was the defense minister who showed such disrespect that the military leader of Mali had to use a French poet to tell the defense minister, if you don't have anything to say, it is better to shut up. Okay, Paris has misconstrued African agents, and they think they can still, like a marionette, pull their strings and people will dance. What they want is an extended war. But luckily enough, Joe Biden, in all his confusion, has decided that he will play a different type of politics in Niger, undercutting the French push for this intervention. There's quite a bit more as to why a select group of people want this intervention. But probably this is not the best forum for us to talk about it. But several capitals, if you look or we disaggregate the interest of the US, Holland, the Czech Republic, Turkey, France, and the narratives from these capitals, even those who claim that Niger is very poor, have even taken away their humanitarian aid. Okay, so what kind of aid, if you look at the United States, in the last 9 years, they've given Niger $500 million. Okay, now that is decent money that ought to have changed lives, but it doesn't change lives. Yes, Sunil, the Americans have 1,100 troops, the French have 1,500. Critical question: what kind of security force assistance is it that does not understand and appreciate the poverty, the neglect, and the pain that the people that you are assisting are facing? And whose security force assistance anyway? Because the people of Niger are not complaining about all these things. Are we afraid of the violence coming into Paris, London, Tokyo, and Washington? So Niger raises fundamental questions about the nature of partnerships and the way that we perceive ourselves as Africans and how we want to develop ourselves.
Thank you very much, Bafo. Bafo, if you can unmute yourself. Okay, whilst Bafo is preparing to come on board, I have a question from Prince Ofoe Akoto. Prince, Bafo, just a second, and let's hear from Prince. Yes.
Yes, Doc, thank you very much. So looking at it from this angle, yes, we have corruption in Africa. Yes, our elections are fraudulent. Yes, the West are exploiting our resources or our politics and the rest. But should we be romanticizing with coup juntas in Africa? Should we say they are the option to these challenges? Is there no other means than coup d'etat?
I think that this question was amply discussed at the beginning when they said that some of these issues have come from near implosions within the countries, sometimes dissatisfaction, governance challenges, and so on. So they've provided that kind of background to answer the question. But maybe Bafo can speak better on that in addition to his own closing remarks.
Yeah. First of all, I think none of the three of us has spoken in support of coup or making coup the only option. Not at all. In fact, our preference is not to have a coup d'etat. But when it comes, how do we deal with it? I think that has been the focus of our discussion. So please, we are not really in support of soldiers. In fact, one of my colleagues said blunt that soldiers should pick off the political arena. That's not for them. And whenever they enter, it becomes a bigger problem for any country. Ghana, who've experienced it 5 times. One of them stayed for 11 years without challenge, and still Ghana is where it is today. So we don't fancy military coups at all. Now to my closing remarks. For saying that my good friends have really addressed almost all the questions that were posed. So I will just capture mine in a few areas. Some of the questions, especially referring to the state capture and the prevalence of military regimes, they are of course not healthy. And other things. I think we should put this more or less in the context of the failure of democracy that I discussed in the earlier remarks that I made. Because clearly, and I think my colleagues agree, that having elections every 4 years or 5 years to turn over governments is not democracy. You may call it, even if there are no violence or there's violence, simply it's an electoral democracy. That's an aspect of democracy. That's why somebody has said very cleverly that you can have elections without democracy, But you can never have elections. You can never have democracy without elections, because election is key in deciding who rules. We've been successful, especially in Ghana. We've been turning off, but that doesn't mean at all that we are getting the democratic dividend. So that I think I can respond. But then I want to drive quickly to the issue of ECOWAS. Whether I should help set free these neo-colonial states, in my own words, that is to say, these Francophone countries, that was raised. And also how ECOWAS deals with other challenges in West Africa. I put all this into two broad areas. First, we have to still recognize, unfortunately, that West African countries are in a serious state of dependency. The dependency syndrome is very prevalent. There's no single country in West Africa that can be said to be independent. So, and that also means that we still have new colonial economies, what Akufo-Addo referred to in his campaign as the Gettysburg economy in Ghana. We're still doing that. We are the hewers of wood and drawers of water. And these two things together makes it difficult for us to deal or engage with international powers. And that relates to the problem of proxy war that was also raised by one of the participants. These external powers have easy access because you are dependent. And that is why I believe that the formation of AU, at least from Nkrumah's time, the African Unity, and even the formation of ECOWAS in 1975, in my view, were meant to break both conditions. Because if we talk about ECOWAS, economic community, then we can be hoping that at some point, a unified economy will give us some power. We don't have it. Even the attempt to have a unified currency, the ECO, we haven't succeeded because of these dependency syndrome in extreme sense, as Kwesi defined, or one of my colleagues said, recounting how these countries are made to save in France, getting tax on the interest, all kinds of things. So it's deeper there. And because of that, even the collective interest in having a common currency has failed. Okay? So the original intent of ECOWAS then, as well as the AU, in my humble view, has not succeeded. We are still in these two conditions, the neo-colonial economy and the dependency syndrome that seems to have engulfed all of us. So we are looking for strategies to exit. I'm not talking about exiting the war in Niger, exiting from the dependency syndrome and the neo-colonial economies that we have. Then I think ECOWAS and AU, both of them, should rethink the approach to the unity that was the dream of the founding fathers of these two bodies. I'll end there.
Thank you very, very much. We just have a little under 15 minutes to go. We've been on this dialogue, the 60+ dialogue, discussing the Niger crisis with Professor Vladimir Nchudanson, Professor Bafwa Jimanduya, and Professor Kwesi Ening. Thus far, we've really delved into the subject of the crisis, some of the antecedents, the consequences or the likely consequences, and indeed have had a snapshot of what we could expect if things don't go well. And I think it's been overwhelmingly clear that nobody would like us to go to war. I have not been to war. I'm not a soldier, but I've spent time after the war in Liberia. And I can tell you that if there's anything soldiers don't want to see, it's even mopping up after the war. What I saw in Liberia after the war, we spent 2 years there helping them to restore electricity. The way the country was ravaged, it will blow your mind. And I don't wish it on any country, much less our neighbor. Africa is intertwined by what I would say, languages and cultures. The borders are largely artificial. Across the borders are the same families. Sometimes they go to school on one side and live on the other side. So I think we do have a reason not to go to war. But that can be the discussion on another day. And I'd like to ask perhaps Vlad to make your closing remarks, and then Kwesi, and then we can round up today's discussion. I think you are mute. Vlad, you are mute. Yes, now we can hear you.
I think we have had a very, very, very fruitful discussion, and it's clear that the essence of ECOWAS, very beautiful, lofty ideals, but they forgot one thing, and I think they forgot themselves, that regional security complexes go with regional integration. They got this, a lesson from this when we had hiccups in Sierra Leone and Liberia and Sierra Leone, and ECOMOG went in. Okay, we dissolved ECOMOG just because we were unable to have what it takes to have a regional standby force. Now, as one of the panelists mentioned, you know, going into such an operation, you need 3 times. You mentioned 2 times. No, in military, I'm working with them and I know what it takes. You need 3 times the force structure of your opponent. So if Niger has 20,000 plus force, to be beefed up by Burkina, Mali, Algeria, and Libya, then you need a huge force. Then your planning, your logistics, and where are you going to base, and which formations are you going with? These are all things that ECOWAS doesn't have what it takes to have. We just don't have it. So we're going into we're just going into slaughter our own soldiers. And as I've said, if we made such mistake, then we shall have put to light a lot of flames on the West African sub-region. And I think one of the questioners also mentioned, from Mauritania all the way to Sudan, we have such fires already. And then I asked a question: if ECOWAS had this blueprint for douching such fires, if it happened to countries like Nigeria, especially Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, could we use the same measure in going in? So we should be very careful about most of the things that we say we want to do. Other than that, the next thing will be self-implosion. There will not be any ECOWAS at all. So I think we have all said that the appeal to force is not the way to go. Again, we need to interrogate ourselves about the question of democracy. What kind of democracy? Whose democracy? And democracy for whom? And I think Farid gave us an inkling into what kind of democracy we're practicing. Because it's an alien concept somehow, the nature of it that we have adopted is so alien, we want to please our masters by saying that, oh, we have elections, we have constitution, we have this. I was elected democratically. So that the word democratically means that between elections, I could do whatever I want. No accountability. It's ECOWAS interrogating accountability in between elections. So when the soldiers come in, they come in because of the vacuum that is created in between elections. And again, when our own civilian elected governors are ruling, what we tell them, how do we police them? Mention has been made of Ouattara and several other countries, Benin and Togo and other places, and what is happening in Senegal. We must watch all this and make sure that the soldiers are not invited. Finally, I still maintain that the ballot does not stop the bullet, and we must watch that. Thank you. I'm done, actually.
Thank you very much. Tracy, if you can also have your closing comments.
Well, first and foremost, let me thank everybody who has taken part in this. I think the quality and the openness and the respect with which we've had this conversation shows that we all have a collective interest and a concern about nudging our governments and our multilateral institutions to place our interests at the very center of governance. And I think the shift or the conversations around what type of governance that we are looking for, from one of purely routine 4-year processes to one that actually contains the germ of security, of development, of inclusiveness, to which people can feel that their interests are taken care of. I think will contribute to creating a responsive, safe, secure, and developed sub-region for all of us. So let me thank you once again for a really very pleasant team. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, my dear panelists, Professor Vladimir Nchidanson, Professor Kwesi Enning, and Professor Bafo Ajimandia. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the 60 Plus platform, we'd like to say thank you for sharing your evening. Clearly, as I indicated, behind the scenes, we are looking at whether we should have a second discussion, but this will be announced afterwards. But clearly, over this past nearly 2.5 hours, we've looked at the Niger crisis. And what has come up clearly from the discussions is that there has been a challenge in terms of the role, the frontal role played by the regional body. Clearly, democracy is in a crisis. And what we see from Atlantic to the Red Sea is not for nothing. It is also a symbol, or it symbolizes challenges in the quality of democracy. And if we need to prevent it from spreading, then it is important that we review the nature of governance, the nature of responsiveness to citizens' needs. I think the language used by my panelists, which was much poignant, was responsiveness to public sentiment. These are clear lessons that we must work on. And they also said that you cannot resolve a crisis such as this if you have unfulfillable protocols that have lost their bite and, if you will, their relevance in time and space. So I think that this evening, we have only touched the subject, but we hope that it also provides good fodder for public policy interventions moving forward. Clearly, there is more to discuss, and on behalf of the panelists, I say thank you, our dear listeners and viewers. We also streamed live on YouTube, and the link has been shared on this platform in the chat box. But for those of you who would still want us to engage you post this dialogue, you may please send in your emails and telephone numbers and your full names before the chat closes at 9:05 this evening. For all of you who have joined us from far and near, we say thank you. We bless we bless you for joining us, and may your evening be as sweet as it has been for us. On that note, I'll say thank you very much. And once again, this has been a 60 Plus dialogue series, and the production team was led by Richard Ghani, the administrator of the platform. Thank you very much. My name is Eric Yanka, your humble moderator. Thank you very much, team, and good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.